Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the Oxford Brookes um, uh, wonderful Healthy Aging Month. My name is Katie Birch. I'm an Assistant Director at the Institute of Public Care, which is a research and development unit that's embedded in Oxford Brookes University. And I've been asked along today to share something from our early early days experiences of evaluating a really interesting transformation program in adult carer support in Norfolk. An interesting angle on the programme is that it is supported by a social impact bond, or SIB. So I'm hoping all of you on the webinar today will be interested in at least one of those elements, if not both. I'm transmitting from my garden shed in Bath, which is feeling quite cosy, and from where I hope not to be interrupted for the hour we have for the webinar, except perhaps by some birds who might be pecking at the window where I've left some seeds. And I hope you're all sitting as comfortably as me. I'm imagining that you might be sitting in an armchair with a packed lunch, perhaps, and a cup of coffee, or that even you might be on a brisk lunchtime walk with a dog, question mark. Getting a bit of daylight exercise as we draw towards winter. Or maybe I'm confusing this with a podcast, I don't know. Either way, I hope you enjoy the webinar. And just a couple of things before we get started, just by way of housekeeping. As I said, the webinar lasts for an hour. It will be recorded so that it can be shared more widely afterwards. And after the webinar, you should receive by way of email a link to the recording, but you yourselves are anonymous, so nobody else can see you attending this webinar. You're also muted. Oh no, I can't hear you. I can only hear my own voice for a whole hour. Um, I can't hear you. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me, but actually, perhaps more significantly, I hope you can see the materials that I brought along today, these slides that I'm going to be referencing. But even if you can't see them, and I understand that there may be some reasons, technical reasons why you can't, you'll be able to see the slides again at the end of the talk. So without more ado, I'm going to suggest we get started. Oh, no, I can't. Before we get started, I need to mention about questions. Yes, last thing to mention, do please ask questions of me as we go along. I've been advised, and this is my first webinar, I'm a bit of a novice, so I've gone along with the advice that the best thing to do is to ask you to pose questions in the little questions box that you should be able to see on your screen, and that towards the end of the talk, I'll come to those and try and answer as many as I can. And if I can't answer them all in the time, I will answer them subsequently, and you'll be able to see my responses. So let's get started. So as I said, I work for the Institute of Public Care. It's an organisation that's been going for over 25 years now, and we're part of Oxford Brookes University, and we work with a range of clients at a national level, national government, national umbrella bodies, national voluntary organisations, and also with people working regionally and locally. And we're all about helping to deliver better health and social care outcomes. And our USP is a combination of professional experience, so experience of working in public care services, often at quite a senior level, with academic rigor. So we have people who bring different expertise within the unit around those two areas, and we're certainly all about driving improvement and innovation and generating learning for people working in organizations and communities. As I said, we work with a range of different organisations. You'll see on this slide, a little bit busy, green and blue, and we work on a number of different topics, including leadership and change, commissioning, collaboration and integration, and also we have a really big ongoing interest in outcomes, thinking about outcomes and how they're generated for the purposes of services and projects, and how to measure the impact of services in outcome terms. And then along the bottom there of the slide, you'll see all the different types of work we get up to, from anything from consultancy and work on informatics through to skills development and research and evaluation. And I'm going to talk with you today about a project that falls within that category. Um, so, um, I'm going to talk about this project that we have just embarked upon in Norfolk. It's a 3 to 4 year evaluation of a transformation programme. We have no findings from fieldwork as such to share with you today. What I do have to share is some reflections on the early stages of the project, including a rapid research review that we've undertaken to inform it, and also a little bit around our methodology for the evaluation, which I hope will be of interest to academics and practitioners alike, because a lot of it is to do with how we measure carer well-being. The focus is on people providing unpaid care as opposed to paid care, and it is also focusing on adult carers of adults in the main. We're aware that there are carers of different guises throughout society across the UK, but our focus here today and for this project is adult carers of adults. I'm really aware with the eminent audience today that I'm at risk here of teaching grandmas, listening grandmas to suck eggs. But I did want to just start with some basics about unpaid care and unpaid carers in the UK. And this first slide just is a reminder that there are many, many unpaid carers in the UK. The lower figure on this screen, 6 million, comes from the 2011 census, and the upper figure, 9 million, comes from some polling that was carried out by an eminent national umbrella body, Carers UK. But I can see that Carers UK and others generally tend to report a conservative 6.5 million figure. What you can't see from these figures is that there's also an estimated churn in the adult carer population of around 2 million every year. And that's people stopping caring and starting caring responsibilities. In fact, of course, we never stop caring. I mean, stopping caring responsibilities and starting caring responsibilities. And I suspect this year that those figures will have inflated on both sides, sadly. So, who is a carer? Good question. I've just pinched this definition from Carers UK. So these are people providing unpaid care, looking after someone who's ill or older or disabled. It could be a friend or partner or another member of the family. This could be for just a few hours a week, or it could be around the clock in someone's home. So there are carers come in many shapes and sizes, but we do know that there's a peak age for someone being an unpaid carer, and that's age 50 to 64 years, which I'm sure will come as no surprise to you. And the fastest growing age group for unpaid carers is aged 85 plus. It will also be of no surprise that there are more women, slightly more women than men, who are unpaid carers. And female carers are more likely than men to be what's sometimes referred to, I think slightly unfortunately, as sandwich carers. And all that really means is you're caring for people of different generations. So that might be caring for an elderly parent at the same time as caring for children, say. We know that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic carers are more likely than others to look after older members of the family and for longer. So, for per week, I mean, so for 20 hours plus per week. So just a kind of brief outline there of some of the demographics around carers, but also thinking about who these carers are caring for. I mean, a real range, quite frankly. So yes, the elderly in relation to the overall topic for this series, but also people with dementia of all ages, people with mental health problems, people with cancer needing end of life care, people who may have substance misuse or have suffered a stroke, and so on. Um, and the largest carer group are thought to be providing care for parents, and that's about 40% of those providing unpaid care, followed by carers who are caring for a spouse or partner, about a quarter, and so on. About a third of carers live within walking distance of the person they're caring for. Obviously, some of those will be in the same home, but quite a large proportion, about 45%, live over 30 minutes away. So a real range there of different caring scenarios. I just wanted to touch on something that I've described here as the hidden world of caring. I guess, like a lot of other things that happen mainly behind closed doors, it's difficult to know with a high degree of certainty what are the real facts and figures. And we certainly know that there are some, perhaps many carers who are either unrecognised societally, so perhaps because they're not eligible for specific forms of services, or because they don't think of themselves as a carer. Something along the lines of, well, I just do the shopping for my mum and I pop in a few times a week. We think that this is particularly the case for older carers, for BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic carers, and for carers who are LGBTQ, who may be more likely, that's the hypothesis, to feel that this is just part of an ongoing relationship with the person that they're providing care for. So interesting, I hope, background leading into what it is we're doing in Norfolk. So the Norfolk Transformation Programme is, I think it is ambitious. It's a programme for the next 5 years. It's all about supporting adult unpaid carers in Norfolk, and there are 3 key aims. The first aim is to increase the number of known carers, going back to the point I made earlier about the hidden world of caring, and to make sure that the needs of carers within the group of those accessing services and those perhaps who aren't yet accessing services, to make sure that those needs are better understood, and also to provide information at the very least, and informal support for all carers. A second aim is to improve carer well-being, and I'll come to how one might define carer well-being in a moment, and how difficult that is. But that's a very clear aim of this programme. And then the third aim is to help carers to sustain their caring role, essentially to prevent the breakdown of care. So those are the overall aims, and I better be a bit careful here because the program is still in its early-ish stages, and a lot of this will emerge over time. But the sorts of transformations that in Norfolk they have in mind are things like having a better and improved, more accessible front door into support, whether people are just looking for some signposting or for something more substantial. they're definitely looking to encourage carers to get more help before reaching a crisis. Um, and there's a key role within the transformation, which are these people called carer connectors, who they're hoping will help carers with more significant needs across that spectrum to navigate and access support across a range of agencies and over time. So those are some of the key transformations that in Norfolk they have in mind. Now, I mentioned this social impact bond earlier, and this is is quite a key part of the new arrangements in Norfolk and the transformation programme. And I've got a slide up here which has just got a visual generic diagram describing how social impact bonds work mostly. And essentially, the key things to note here, and again, many of you listening may already know about SIBs and have SIBs. And if I had been a bit more sophisticated leading up to today's webinar, I'd have got you to kind of do a poll or something fancy about how many of you are already involved with a SIB. But again, at the risk of teaching grandmas to suck eggs, the key difference in terms of a social impact bond compared with traditional arrangements for funding public services is, instead of directly funding or commissioning provider services using, say, local council funding, a SIB is set up to generate often increased investment and improve the focus for delivery through this method. So I'm just going to walk you through that. So on the right hand side of this diagram, you have people investing in the SIB. That's likely to be multiple rather than single. And they invest in rather than pay for an outcomes-based contract, either directly with a provider or a group of providers. As you'll see, I'm pointing to my screen, but anyway, it's what I can see. A dotted line there, the white dotted line going direct to providers. More frequently, more commonly, the investment is in an organisation, a social impact bond delivery agency, often known as an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. And essentially, this is an organisation that's set up to manage funds and investments like these, often in the public sector. And in our case, the SPV and fund manager is Bridges, which is a relatively well-known, respected organisation who attract and manage investments that are made by people and organisations who are interested in schemes, essentially, and programs that have a potential, at least, to have a positive impact societally on society. These are sometimes known as conviction investors, and I'm sure some of you will have heard that phrase before. So the SPV, Bridges in this case, managed the investment, working closely with the public sector, in this case, Norfolk County Council on that left-hand side of the diagram. So the organisation or organisations that will eventually pay up if the intended outcomes for the programme are met. I should say that Bridges aren't just concerned with carer support. They are involved in a range of SIB projects, anything from family preservation schemes for children and families through to self-care for people with long-term conditions. So this isn't just about carer support. So what do we know about the value of social impact bonds? The short answer, unfortunately, is not much yet. And there's a reason for that, because although there are evaluations of SIB programs, those evaluations understandably focus more on whether they're achieving their overall aims, their objectives, the outcomes they set out to achieve, and rather less on the specific value of the SIB in achieving those. And it's obviously really difficult to disentangle and to evidence. But some studies suggest, have some evidence that a SIB can provide a boost to service flexibility and innovation, particularly if there's increased investment, but not only in those circumstances. In some cases, there's been a link with improved performance management of provider services against agreed aims. And in some cases, it's demonstrated that there's better data, there's basically better information about how services are working than might traditionally be the case. There's sort of more intensive and more honed monitoring of how services are working. The things to maybe watch with SIBs that are reported is something, first of all, something called the SIB paradox. I don't know why it's a paradox, it just seems logical. So the more attractive it is for investors, essentially the less attractive it may be for public service commissioners and vice versa. That's a really obvious point to make. But there are other potential bear traps just to watch. So if obviously with the wrong kind of incentives or targets, that may lead to some form of cherry picking or perverse incentives, or even indeed with the right incentives or targets, that may still happen, and hence the need perhaps for more monitoring. That's usually around a concern or a worry that the SIB providers will focus on people who, in relation to whom it's easier to achieve the outcomes. There's a range of other things just to watch, and the third bullet there just really resonates for me in the context of providing support for unpaid carers. Obviously, the outcomes may depend on a range of services, not least in that scenario, the support that's available direct to the cared for person. And so there's a real danger that one focuses too much in isolation on a particular form of service in its own bubble, as opposed to thinking about how it's working in the context of a whole system of supports that are interlinked. Obviously, it can take a while for financial savings to be generated through that might be in this case through less use of residential care, fewer carer breakdowns. Um, so obviously, it goes without saying, important to think about and spend some time on identifying the right outcomes for programs like this. So that's all about the program in Norfolk, or an introduction to the program in Norfolk. And I just want to mention about our evaluation. But first of all, I just want to check on the timing. How are we doing for time? Okay, so we're about 20 minutes or so into this session. And I'm going to look now at the evaluation that I'm leading in Norfolk with the rest of the team at IPC. So the key attributes are just listed here. So we really wanted to co-produce the evaluation, not only at the start, but ongoing with colleagues in Norfolk. So that's colleagues working within the provider partnership, but also with colleagues in the council. It's a mixed method evaluation, so we're looking at large scale quantitative data, but we're also looking at qualitative sources of information, say from interviews and so on. We're definitely wanting to incorporate regular feedback loops into the process, so that we're not having a big da-da moment at the end of 3-4 years, but that we're helping to constantly feed back what we're seeing into the program, so the program can continue to develop. And we're hoping to generate findings that are, of course, of use to Norfolk and providers working in Norfolk, the fantastic providers working in Norfolk, but also for others in the sector. And we're hoping also to compare with other sites where that's possible, so comparator sites. I would just mention, for those who are interested in evaluation and research techniques, it's a realistic evaluation. So all that really means is we're looking not just whether things work, in what quantity, but also what works for whom. Obviously, we're expecting here to have a carer population that's quite varied. So some things may work for some of those carers, but not for others. Um, in what circumstances? So whether carers are in crisis or at an early stage of caring, or just looking for information. Um, why do things work, and to what extent do they work? So all of those questions are really important for this evaluation. You may not be able to see the information on this next slide. So I'm just going to walk you through it. But basically, there's a number of different core elements. I mentioned data already, and we've agreed with the site what sort of data we think would be important. And for the most part, this is data that they would want to collect in any event themselves and are collecting. So what can we add? Where can we add value here through evaluation? Well, we can certainly undertake some interviews with carers who would like to participate. And it goes without saying that in the current climate, a lot of those interviews will be done remotely. And there's a lot we're learning as researchers, and have been in an accelerated way in the last few months, about how to do really good quality, ethical interviews with service users, whether that's by Zoom or telephone or other methods. And that's a really important element within this evaluation. And we're hoping to hear from carers either individually or in groups. Another key element is case sampling. So we're going to do that, a look in depth at what's happening, particularly for carers with more significant involvement with the programme. Um, and that sampling will look at aspects of how of how they've come into services, and the nature of services, perhaps how regularly, how intensive those services have been, and how able those services have been to meet the needs of those carers. Um, there's various other things on this slide, including reporting and so on, but the one that I want to draw out in more depth is the longitudinal survey of as many carers as possible who consent to participate. Um, uh, and the reason why I want to talk about that is because um, we have become, I think it's fair to say, at IPC, uh, well, we've developed quite a lot of expertise around certainly online surveys and certainly longitudinal surveys. So we've been experimenting for a while in how to do that well. We've got a number of existing projects and finished projects that have used a methodology around remote longitudinal surveys that are delivered online. However, for this evaluation, sorry, I'm being slightly distracted by the sun. I'm just going to lower my shade so that so I'm not squinting at you. Um, so more about the survey. So we definitely identified, including through work with carers in Norfolk who were willing to be involved, and we're very grateful to them for being involved and helping us to design this survey. We very much noted that it needed to be as concise, short as possible. It needed to ask about their experiences of seeking and getting help and the impact of any help they do get. We wanted it to include at least one measure of carer well-being, and as part of our rapid research review, we explored what measures there are out there, standardized measures of carer well-being. And it's a very interesting area, stroke minefield. In summary, what we found is that there are a lot of generic measures of well-being for the adult population. There are rather few, but there are some measures of carer well-being. And the question is, what bits do you want to focus on? Do you want to look at people's physical well-being, their psychological well-being, social well-being? Some commentators have even talked about spiritual well-being, which is not terribly well represented in current standardized measures. So we had a lot of questions in there about what we wanted our measure to focus upon. And we drilled down essentially, and eventually opted for the carer wellbeing and support questionnaire, sometimes known as the carer questionnaire. We chose it because it's specific to carers, which was quite important for this evaluation. We thought it covered quite a range of aspects of carer wellbeing, or domains of carer wellbeing, everything from financial wellbeing, physical wellbeing, emotional health and well-being, and others. And it's capable of measuring distance traveled, so just change over time, so change in people's well-being, which is obviously really important for a longitudinal survey. The other key things to say about this approach is that through our experimentation with online longitudinal surveys of this sort of nature before, including with different types of carer groups across the UK, is really important to have a help desk. So that's basically a member of the research team who's on hand to help people participate on their terms, um, to help troubleshoot any issues they may have with participation, to just generally be as helpful as possible, and also to schedule follow-up surveys. So in this case, we wanted to make sure people could participate online by telephone, so they can literally give their responses down the phone to a researcher, or by post. Um, and we're really actively supporting, including between surveys sometimes, the group. So really important to keep people bound in as much as possible to the evaluation on the basis of ongoing informed consent. So really understanding what it is they're being asked to contribute, on what basis, and what we're going to do with the with our findings. So, well, I hope that's interesting. I find online surveys interesting, but you may not be as interested as me in some of that technical detail. But what I hope you may be interested in is a little bit of information from our rapid research review that relates to what we know, what the evidence base says, um, about adult carer support needs, and how, as you won't see that on this slide, but and how to support adult carers effectively. So within that, and I'm really, concentrating all the evidence base here. So many apologies for people who are experts in the evidence base here, but there are so many things one could say about adult unpaid carers needs, support needs. And it goes without saying that those are very personal, individual to the carer, and may be very different from carer to carer. But a key concept within the literature around carer support needs is this concept of the burden of care, and how significant it is. And the key message from a lot of the literature is that the burden of care is not only objective, so to do with the amount of care that someone's giving, or how long it lasts, or how intense it is, but it is also subjective. So it is both. And it's really important how someone perceives. This is of course also logical. It's really important how someone perceives their caring experience, either positively or negatively, or, as is much more common, both. And the research suggests that very often carers are in fact living with mixed feelings about caring pretty much constantly. And that often we go through positive and negative cycles, sometimes on quite a regular basis. And a typical cycle, but by no means the only cycle, is fairly early on in a caring experience. intellectually putting one's own needs aside to a greater extent, um, and then later circling back or coming to much more thinking about one's own needs and well-being. But of course, that cycle may be pretty constant as well as a longer journey of caring. I hope that's helpful by way of background, and it certainly leads into some of the other points that I want to make about um, what works in supporting unpaid adult carers. Um, and the focus here for the next slides is certainly around including to prevent breakdown in caring responsibilities. Um, so um, I looked at this slide this morning and I thought, oh no, it's really busy, and perhaps you can't see all the different wording on it. There's quite a long list of common risk factors for carer breakdown. Um, and also, I realise I haven't really organised this very well, but in a funny sort of way, it emphasises that message that I mentioned earlier, which is that there are objective factors and there are subjective factors that contribute here. So some of the objective factors that may be risk factors for breakdown include providing more, so a greater amount of care on a weekly basis, providing sustained intensive care, might be experiencing regular sleep disturbance, it might be having a relatively poor financial situation, or just being worried about finances. It might be as people get older and are finding the physical um, burden of care more substantial. Um, it might be the challenging or upsetting behaviour of the cared for person, although that may also be a combination of objective and subjective. It may be that the carer themselves has ill health, and we know that a really significant proportion of carers, adult carers of adults, have their own long-term conditions to manage. So those are some of the more objective things, and some of the more subjective things may be things like feeling trapped or helpless or out of control. It may be having sustained negative feelings about the caring that one is doing, or where the relationship with the cared for person becomes very difficult or very difficult. Or it may be about feeling stigmatized by being a carer. So these are all the factors, as I said, objective and subjective, that may be risk factors for carer breakdown. And I hope it's useful to organize them like that, as I said, quite mixed up. Similarly, I've organized another slide, which is maybe similarly busy, but I hope helpful. Things that mitigate or can mitigate carer breakdown. So these are the things that we know from the evidence base do that. Again, objective and subjective mixed. So some of the more objective things are having access to another identity. Interesting use of the word identity in the literature. Having access to another life or element of one's life. Having access to a broader or another set of relationships beyond that of a carer. Other protective or mitigating factors include having an earlier experience of being a carer, knowing what to do, being able to take a break from caring, the quality of support that's available in the community for that person. So a few objective factors there. There are also quite a few subjective factors, or mixed at least. So some of the more mixed ones are where carers are able to accept a degree of uncertainty. Interesting factor there. Being open to help. Feeling positive or more positive about being a carer in spite of that sort of cycle of feelings about the responsibility. Having or deploying coping strategies. These are all along the same sort of theme, aren't they? and having an understanding of the cared for person's condition. That's really a real mixed one there. So interesting, different factors that can mitigate breakdown, and some of those are, if you like, the opposite of some of the risk factors. But I hope interesting to see, sort of just arranged like this. Um, well, you're bound to ask, I'm bound to ask, well, that's all very well, knowing about risk factors and protective or mitigating factors, but what is the best form of support? I mentioned community support. Um, and the short answer is we know some things from the evidence base, but I would say we're very much at the beginning of a much longer journey in our understanding about what works. And that would be the same, I think, for a range of other forms of public services for people. I work quite a lot looking at other types of carers, so maybe foster carers or adoptive parents or other people who are either receiving public service support or who care for people receiving public service support. Um, Also, I'm a researcher, so I'm bound to say we're on a long journey, aren't I? Um, so I'm coming towards the end of my presentation now, but I just wanted to touch on some of the things that we perhaps do know, as opposed to the things we don't know. So here on this slide, a lot in the research is talked about ways of working with carers. So whatever the support being provided, and through whatever organisation, however it's assessed. It's these sorts of things are really important characteristics. So things like making sure that all interactions with carers, from helping professional services, should be aimed at promoting their well-being, because of and spite of caring, and be outcomes based. A key element, and I would say again, this crosses a number of different services for people in the public. I was about to say public sector, but in terms of public services provided with public funding for people. And it's really about people being genuinely listened to and respected and seen as experts on their own lives. This is so tremendously important, and it comes up time and time again in work with and alongside service users, including carers. So this is working with people and not to people or for people. Linked with that, there's something really important about people having skills, whatever their professional background, at something that can be described as collaborative conversations with carers, including to help build on their strengths. So not leaping straight into all the difficulties and problems, although it's important to hear about those, but not making assumptions here, and understanding that in many, many circumstances, there are strengths within situations that are important to understand and acknowledge and build upon. So those things are really important, goes without saying. And researchers or people working within services will be horrified, I'm sure, to hear me and to see me condense all the knowledge out there about what works in terms of actual services into one slide. But I've given it a whirl, and I hope it's helpful. What I'm describing here is what I've said is all the P's. And really all this is doing is drawing out some of the things where there is an evidence base, or a somewhat developed evidence base, around the efficacy of the services. So what have we got here? We've got the first P is proactive and targeted information, education and training. And the proactive is really important. So rather than it being passive, the evidence base suggests that it should be very much looking to engage people actively. And targeted is important in that the evidence base seems to suggest that just having generic information and support for carers, adult carers even, isn't that helpful. It's better where it's targeted at carers caring for people with particular conditions, for example, dementia. And within that cluster, I'm including education and training programs around the specific needs of carers caring for people with specific needs. I'm going to jump then to the third one I mentioned there. So this is to do with personalised respite. It's a bit of an old-fashioned term, isn't it? More often now, reference the short breaks for people from their caring responsibilities. Now, I should say that the evidence here is mixed. So if you ask carers about how important those sorts of services are for them, they'll say things like lifesaver, really important, don't take it away from me. They really know and understand how important that is. But when asked in more depth about their experiences of short breaks from their caring responsibilities, many carers will report to researchers that it's a more mixed feeling about it. So they may feel that it's a worrying time, not always as enjoyable as it might be, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes carers will describe feeling anxiety and guilt during those periods of short breaks from caring. Um, and the key bit here within the evidence base is that these short breaks should be personalised. So we shouldn't just think that there's a one size fits all. Maybe an obvious point again, but really important. No, actually, not finally. A third area, but very important area, is around peer support. And actually, here is where there's much more of an evidence base, a much more developed evidence base. And there seems to be really good evidence of impact on carer psychologically and in terms of their emotional well-being on peer support. Obviously, this is through because of a range of different elements to a lot of peer support, including importantly the shared experience element. So being able to normalize and validate one's experiences with a group or even just one other carer, and also having opportunities to help others as well as being helped oneself. So that combination of features of peer support seem to make it really impactful. Last but not least, I want to mention psychosocial interventions. This is a really interesting area, um, and so it's a kind of fancy term, really, for a kind of a niche-ish area and more recently developed area in carer support. And in a nutshell, these sorts of interventions, which can be delivered one-to-one, but more commonly within a group, aim to promote effective adaptation towards an equilibrium. So essentially, lay terms, ways of coping, both psychologically and socially, or in fact. So examples of these sorts of interventions are things like meditation techniques, CBT or other reframing techniques, programs and training, if you like, around managing with uncertainty or developing coping strategies. And often they combine practical and psychological concepts and ideas and elements. They've been shown so far to be particularly effective with carers of people with dementia and with cancer and strokes. And the improvements have been demonstrated in carers in terms of their overall psychological state, if you like. So that might be with particular emotional health and well-being issues such as depression, and also with their perceived burden of care, it being lighter. The key thing to note around this is that some gains may not be long term off the back of just one session, say. So the suggestion is from the evidence base that people need to have access to top-up sessions. The other thing to note about this, interesting in the current climate, is there's really quite good evidence of effective remote delivery and obviously some of the cost benefits alongside that. But a key finding, really important message around these psychosocial interventions, actually along with all of these, is that their main use and benefit is alongside rather than instead of other supports. So not just seeing them as just a silver bullet in their own right. I'm almost finished now, and I'm just going to check the time to see if we've got how much time we've got. Oh, we've got 10 minutes almost for questions. Um, so I just wanted to mention another aspect from within the evidence base about what works in terms of support that goes more broadly, if you like, across different services and in society. And there is definitely some good evidence of the importance of um, uh, support for carers in employment, and having employers who are carer friendly and who can help carers sustain their caring role as well as their job. And particularly important, given the point I mentioned earlier, which is that quite a few carers feel that they cannot sustain a job in the context of their caring role, particularly female carers. Um, and obviously, a harder ask for one service, perhaps a local authority, to achieve, and really emphasizes the importance here of the whole system working together, of society working together to ensure that carers are given the best support and opportunities for themselves to thrive as possible. So I've come to the end of my presentation. There's a link here to contact me about the evaluation, and please do if you wish. I should say that we have some summaries of the rapid research review if you want to get in touch. I've got some other things I've been told to say. So feedbacks and thoughts about this presentation and this subject area on the Healthy Aging website and on social media using the hashtag healthy age, sorry, I'll say that again, hashtag healthy aging 2020. You can also sign up to the Healthy Aging Network through the Oxford Brookes webpage, and there should be a link to that coming up in an email that you'll receive after this presentation. So those are the things that I've been asked to say, and I'm going to come, I hope, to some questions. Now, I've got to make sure that I can see some of these. So some of the ones that I've been asked here, I'm just going to start at the top. So I've been asked, why did Norfolk decide to take the SIB route? Well, that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that's one that we've really totally understood, because we have come into this program once the SIB route had been decided. But my understanding is, going back to some of the benefits of the SIB, that was very much what Norfolk had in mind. So they wanted to promote innovation and dynamic and flexible in responses to carer needs. And I think they were also very aware that in over time that perhaps carer support hadn't been given all the attention that it really required. So they were really interested in innovation in this area and in attracting some investment. So hopefully that's answered your question. Now I'm coming to another one on the list. I'm not mentioning who's asking these questions, by the way, because my understanding is that we want to make sure that everyone stays anonymous. But this question is from someone who was caring for parents towards the end of their lives, and the crisis point came after an emergency. And in this particular case, the council, um, we don't know which council had no provision, and the support couldn't be arranged. Um, so this person's reflection, really, more than a question, I think, is that the current system overall, and I'm assuming this is a reflection on services perhaps across the UK generally, the current system is not designed with emergency support in mind. And really, all I can say there is, um, reflecting on what I've said earlier, that there's clearly some way to go in carer support to really, innovate and improve in this field, and to make sure that people are as well supported as possible across a journey. And I would also say that this is where Norfolk's model is quite interesting, because essentially what they're trying to do is to understand, to get in contact, to be in contact with carers earlier, before people reach a crisis, to understand what the needs are, and to plan proactively as possible. Um, uh, but there's certainly no silver bullet at the moment, and we can just really hope that there's continued innovation in this area. Um, and there's another question here about how investments are paid back, and I'm just going to um, go back through my it's a funny noise. I'm just going to go back through my presentation if I can. Oh, I'm not sure I can. Um, to well, I'll reference the slide on the how SIBs work. So essentially what happens is that the investment is made and the services are provided over an agreed period of time. And depending on whether the outcomes that have been predefined are met, then the SIB manager is paid, and the investors receive their payment, their part of the payment as well. But it depends. It varies from SIB to SIB, so it's really difficult to generalize about how different SIBs work, because um, uh, it all depends, if you like, on the contract that's negotiated. But in general terms, that's how things work. Um, and of course, the providers are still paid in the meantime, so they're not waiting for payment at the end. They're and but in different scenarios, different people working within that whole model take on different degrees of risk in relation to the whole. So very difficult to generalize, as I said. So I hope that's been helpful. We're coming towards the end. I'm just checking on my um, clock. We're coming towards the end of the session. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed talking with you, although I can't see you. I'm just imagining you, you all out there. As I said, you can get hold of a recording of the webinar, either through a link in an email you should be sent afterwards, or indeed on the Oxford Brookes Healthy Aging website page. I hope you can access in one of those ways, including the materials, the slides that I've referenced. I hope you have a very lovely rest of today, and goodbye.